It's a warning that primal forces, when accessed recklessly, can overwhelm the individual. Hello, today I'm going to talk about 10 more occult books that you should read. I've done a video, the first one, on 10 books. This is the second one. If you don't see something here, don't freak out. It might be on the first video. The link is above. It may also be on my Eastern Occult books video or my video on Western alchemy books. There are also works by Crowley and Westcott and Mathers I might put on a third list, but I feel like they are quite dry, while the ones I chose I think are a bit more accessible, so maybe I will do a third list on what might be considered advanced occult books. But I wanted to make this as accessible as possible. I have one honorable mention, The Secret Doctrine from Helena Blavatsky. I like this book, but again, I think it's kind of advanced and it's almost more scientific, definitely kind of dry at times. I talk a bit more about her in my Female Mystics video. You can check that out if you're interested in knowing more. The last thing I'm going to say before we get started is there are some books on here that may surprise you, but they make perfect sense to me. So just remember, this is my list. Your list will probably be different. But let's get started. At number 10, we have The Morning of the Magicians by Louis Pauwels and Jacques Bergier from 1960. So there used to be this used bookstore on Woodward Avenue in Royal Oak, Michigan, just outside of Detroit. And I loved this bookstore. I used to go in there all the time. In my mid-20s, I would take a weekly pilgrimage there from downtown on the bus, and I bought many great books there. One day I picked up a battered copy of this, and I would say it changed my life. I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. It felt like kismet or synchronicity when I found it. The cover just jumped out at me. I'll put the cover on the screen here. It was one of those times in my life where I felt this kind of energy or excitement. I was just connected to it for some reason, and when I took it home, I devoured it. The book is kind of speculative fiction, occult history, and proto-New Age mysticism. I think that's the only way to describe it. It tries to fuse science, the supernatural, and imagination into one vision. It has gotten its share of controversy. There are many unverified claims that are made in the book. People have said there's this uncritical approach to the myth and the pseudoscience. But I would say in a way that's also its charm. And one person's pseudoscience is another person's revelation. So there's that. But this mixes physics, metaphysics, alchemy, surrealism, UFOs, Nazi stuff, psychology, almost everything you can think of when it comes to occultism. And for me, it stimulated my imagination. It's almost a speculative manifesto of sorts. And one thing it taught me is if you want to go deeper into magic, you need a vivid imagination. You need to think outside of the box, and you need to be willing to immerse yourself into a worldview, however crazy it might appear to others. But I think this would be good for someone that's just getting into the occult to kind of spark the imagination. I think it's meant to challenge your cognitive dissonance and also to have you use your critical thinking. I think to the discerning reader, you will be able to kind of take what you want from this and leave the stuff that's maybe too new agey or whatever. You know, I think you need to take it with a grain of salt. I would not look at this as the truth per se, but I do think it helps you go down the road less traveled. It gives you permission to do that, and I think it sparks the imagination. At number 9, we have Psychic Self-Defense by Dion from 1930. This is part occult manual and part memoir of psychic warfare. Fortune claimed the book was based on her real psychic attacks, people attacking her. And I tend to believe her because I've had my own experiences like this over the years. Whether it's a person or an entity, I have had times where I felt like either people were trying to curse me a little bit or I was too open psychically. Fortune was trained as a psychologist, and there is a heavy influence from early psychoanalysis here. She interprets the psychic attacks as projections or repressed energies. This blend blends psychology and magic together. And I would go so far as to say those two things are very connected. There is stuff in here about banishing entities. I think a valuable skill to learn if you believe in this sort of thing. She also talks about how the subconscious can be your worst enemy. She gives many methods. You could almost say defense tactics, visualizations, meditations, the use of salt or light, many, many things. This almost reads like a case file compendium from an astral detective or something. I think the lesson here is that spiritual strength and clear thinking protect better than any ritual. She talks a lot about obsession and fixation and how these can open the doors for ill energies. There's this idea of psychic hygiene, which I think most people do not do. I think if you have any energy vampires or narcissists in your life, this is a must read. Or if you're a Gnostic looking to gain more defenses, this would also be valuable to you, I think. In compiling my list, I realized that I think maybe I should read this again. I read this in my late 20s and I know much more now. If you watch my channel, you know I have a Gnostic point of view these days, but I didn't always. And I'm curious what would happen if I reread this as far as how it might influence my Gnostic perspective, especially concerning the archons and like the demons and things like that that affect us daily. At number 8, we have the Book of Pleasure, Self-Love, The Psychology of Ecstasy by Osman Spare, first published in 1913. This is part mystical treatise, part surreal art project, part personal revelation. The origins of chaos magic can be found here. Spare financed it and printed it himself. As an independent publisher and writer, I find this to be something that I respect a lot. The book is illustrated with Spare's own sigillistic, hallucinatory, automatic drawings. This includes his mythology. Zos represents the individual self or the body, and Kia is the universal consciousness. But what do I appreciate about this? Why am I putting it on this list? Well, I think one of Spare's strengths is that he destroys all of the ceremony in magic. He gets rid of the dogma, the hierarchies, all of it. He's almost more of a visionary. He insists the source of all power lies in the subconscious, which I agree with, and he thinks it can be accessed through self-love, desire, and trance, and I tend to agree with him. He ties creativity and ecstasy into one force, which I think may have influenced Wilhelm Reich and his orgone theory. I might do a video on Reich at a later date, so you can watch out for that. I also talk more about Spare and this book in my Occult Artist video, link above. At number 7, we have Ceremonial Magic from Israel Regardie from 1947, but I read the Dover edition from 2008. If there is an instruction manual on this list, this is it. This basically shows the Hermetic Kabbalah and Golden Dawn system. It gives techniques you can use to concentrate and harness psychic and spiritual potential. If you know his book, The Middle Pillar, which I have on my other list, this expands on it. What's good about this? Well, it's accessible yet detailed, and I actually think a lot of books fail in that way. I appreciate his systematic approach. There's the integration of theory and practice. The book explains why rituals work, drawing on the Kabbalah, astrology, and psychology, rather than just giving rote instructions. There is a focus on personal development, which I think is the most important aspect of occultism. Magic is framed as self-transformation as opposed to supernatural power. He dives into meditation, visualization, and ceremonial discipline. He teaches you how to harmonize the mind and the body. I think it's a quite clear roadmap if you want to get into this aspect of occultism. If you like this and The Middle Pillar, I would check out his book on the Philosopher's Stone. It is also very, very good. That's his deep dive into alchemy, and I think it kind of completes the trifecta of these three. At number 6, we have The Great Secret, or Occultism Unveiled, by Éliphas Lévi from 1868. This is the French occult writer and poet. Initially, he pursued a career in the Catholic Church, but he abandoned the priesthood in his mid-20s and turned to the occult. And at age 40, he began professing knowledge of the occult. He was once a Freemason, but he left the order. It sounds to me like he had a mystical awakening that shook the foundations of his life and faith. He had a very fascinating life, I think, and if you get a moment, you should look into it. just check out his Wikipedia page or something. But if you look into it, I think you will realize his choices show a man who was searching for truth and would abandon anything that didn't get him closer to it. And I think this is kind of a mystical summation of his work, almost like a personal confession or a manifesto. He finished the manuscript shortly before dying, and his student published it after his death, editing parts that were considered too heretical for 19th century France and the Catholic Church. He talks about the great secret as the unity of opposites, spirit and matter, male and female, God and man, all alchemical ideas. This is very introspective, but I think the great secret isn't about summoning forces like so many novice occultists think. It's more about ethics and the mastery of will and how that changes you. But his view was shaped by the Kabbalah, Hermetics, and alchemical symbolism. I think this is more like mystical Christianity laced with Hermetic thought, similar to Emanuel Swedenborg, who I'll talk about in an upcoming video. It's a little dense and difficult to read, but I think there's a lot here. I think this would be good if you're looking for maturity in your occultism. And number 5, we have The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen from 1894. So this is a work of fiction, but I'm including it here because I think it's quite relevant. I read the Dover edition from 2006, which included The Hill of Dreams. And I read this at a time where I was diving deeper into H.P. Lovecraft and M.R. James. He was the logical next brick in the road, let's say, because I wanted to go back to where Lovecraft got a lot of his influences from. This blends horror, mysticism, and sexual transgression. It talks about hidden realities, ancient powers, and cosmic dread, all things that show up in Lovecraft's work. When it was published, they denounced it as degenerate and horrific because of its implied sexual content. Victorian reviewers called it obscene, terrifying, and immoral. It was even considered dangerous reading for women, so watch out, women. But I think it really dives into the uncanny, which I love. I don't want to say too much about the story, but it basically deals with an experiment of seeing the great god Pan. But I think the real purpose of the novella is to show the infinite repercussions of consequence and how if you do unveil something, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. And not only does it affect your life, it affects several lives after. But why am I putting this on an occult book list? I think when you work with the occult, you are accessing hidden knowledge and forbidden visions to some degree, especially if you work with certain occultists. As someone that prefers the Gnostic outlook, I also think that a lot of Gnostic texts are kind of about this. If you really want to understand the occult, you have to think about the primordial. It's not just about now. You have to think about the natural world versus the spiritual world. You have to think about the powers in those things, whether natural or spiritual. You also have to think about initiation and what that actually means. Through initiation, there's the risk of accessing hidden knowledge that might undo you, and you have to be ready for that. But I think this is a cautionary tale, and maybe that's one thing novice occultists don't pay heed to. But I think before you start calling demons or cursing your enemies, you should read something like this. It's a warning that primal forces, when accessed recklessly, can overwhelm the individual. But I think this book was highly influential, not just in occult circles, but in the greater literary world. Bram Stoker, H.P. Lovecraft, Stephen King, and many others were influenced by it. At number 4, we have Images and Symbols by Mircea Eliade from 1952. This is more of a comparative religion and mythology book, but I think it helps you understand the way archetypes and symbols influence the occult, and I think this is indispensable reading. In fact, all of his work would benefit the occultist, I think, even though he's an anthropologist. He was a Romanian who focused on religion and philosophy in his work. He is renowned for his study on myth, initiation, ritual, and the sacred and the profane. So he studies world religions, shamanism, alchemy, and esoteric traditions, identifying recurring archetypes and motifs. And I think his greatest lesson is he distinguishes between the sacred and the profane, showing how symbols and images function as vehicles for transcendent experience. Having said that, I think this is very accessible scholarship. He explains the occult dimension of culture. He also decodes the universal language of the sacred, something that I think is immensely valuable to anyone that is interested in the occult, if you're interested in the occult for the right reasons. When I was in college, I read several of his books. I would actually say he had a pretty large impact on my work there. I had an installation class. Most of the other artists focused on political or sociological work in this class, but I was influenced by this book and his other work, The Sacred and the Profane. I built a sacred circle in a grove on campus. We had this kind of orchard there. I buried a box in the ground with this kind of wood lid on it with a little slit. And I provided pieces of paper and little pencils, and you could write down your desires or regrets or fears, etc., whatever you were kind of psychologically or psychically contending with, and you could write it on the paper and you stick it in the box. Before you did that, you would stand inside this circle of stones that I created, and you'd think about what it is that you wanted to accomplish. At the end of the installation, which was about a week, I think, I don't really recall how long it lasted, but at the end, I buried all the notes in the ground. The wooden lid was kind of like a top on the hole that was already there. But I will say this, it made me realize that a lot of people trusted me more than I thought they would. I don't know what these notes said, but there's part of me that thinks that there might have been, pretty heavy stuff on them. I did notice when I took the lid off that there were many pieces of paper. They were all folded up, but there were many. This could just be seen as some kind of frivolous art project, but I didn't see it that way. And several people came up to me after and said how it influenced them and how it helped them sort out some problems they were having, things that were kind of blocking them. So I think in the end it was successful. And I would say his point of view really inspired me. I think that's one of the things to remember about occult power, if you want to call it that, or occult influence, is that it should be used to help people. It should be used to lessen the burden. I don't think it should be used to get things you want necessarily. At number 3, we have Revolt Against the Modern World by Julius Evola from 1934. So Evola published it in fascist Italy, and I think a lot of people think of him as a fascist, which I don't agree with at all. He despised nationalism, materialism, and egalitarianism, and I think he's been highly misunderstood. But this draws from Hindu metaphysics, Hermeticism, Roman paganism, and Nietzsche, I think. It influenced both right-wing esoteric thinkers and later countercultural mystics. So it's a bit of a contradictory text in some ways, but it examines the cyclical nature of history, this idea of sacred kingship and the decline from the Golden Age. And whether you agree with him or not, he writes with complete conviction. He has an intellectual ferocity, I think, and I respect him for that. Part 1 details the concepts of the traditional worldview, what he sees as the traditional worldview. Part 2 deals with the sicknesses of the modern world, and we have many, I think. He denounces the regressive aspects of modern civilization and instead argues for a traditionalist society. You could almost say his ideas are Nazi-like in some ways, but I think he would criticize the Nazis for being too crude, materialistic, and populist. And I think his view puts most groups into this idea of involution instead of evolution. It's almost like a disassembling of the spiritual man, what he calls the solar man, which is the archetype of a human being, kind of the perfected being. You could almost say it's kind of Nietzschean and the overman, kind of the Übermensch. But this man is aligned with cosmic order, as opposed to being trapped in chaos, materialism, and decadence, all dangers of the modern world. But he doesn't mean solar as in the sun. He means it in a more alchemical sense, like light, clarity, sovereignty, active consciousness, that kind of thing. But I think this book is a good lesson because sometimes you could read the surface level of something and think it's one way, but if you know the symbolism, the different facets of occultism, you get a different read. And unfortunately, a lot of people are always thinking about the surface level of things. At number 2, we have Lectures on Ancient Philosophy by Manly P. Hall. This is a collection of talks by Manly P. Hall. These were done at the Philosophical Research Society in Los Angeles before he formally founded it in 1934. But it's more than that. It's a companion work to The Secret Teachings of All Ages. If you love that, you will love this too. While The Secret Teachings is a kind of encyclopedia, this is more human and conversational. It gets you to see a certain side of him. He blends many ideas in this. I'll put some on the screen just so you can have an idea what this is about. But he was in his late 20s when he had these lectures, and that's hard to believe. It really is. And it makes me a little depressed, actually, because I have so much further to go. And in these lectures, he feels like a teacher speaking directly to you, but he's more than half my age when he did these, and that just makes me feel like I've wasted my life or something. But I think one of his strengths is he has a unified vision. He can take things from everywhere and bring it together. And his emphasis is not on ritual or occult power. It's on moral refinement and the cultivation of wisdom, and I think that's what sets him apart from many occultists. I read this back in the 2000s, shortly after reading The Secret Teachings, and like that book, it also blew me away. In fact, I think at that time, my limited scope wasn't even really ready for it. It almost made like one wall of illusion just drop instantly when I finished it. But I would say his work in general has just really changed me. And if you don't know his work, you should definitely check it out. At number 1, we have Beyond Good and Evil by Friedrich Nietzsche from 1886. So this is a philosophical work. Why do I have this on this list? It does many great things for the occultist, in my opinion. It shatters conventional morality, which is super important to get through that, I think. I'm of the opinion that there is a kind of profane morality, something that you hear on TV, what you're supposed to do or what someone tells you you're supposed to do. But then there's a sacred morality, a higher morality, and you can't really truly reach that unless you break through the lower one. It interrogates the assumptions behind truth, religion, and values. And I think all of these ideas are invaluable to anyone searching for meaning through the occult. And in some ways, it's a kind of philosophical initiation. And like many occult books, what would be deemed as, true occult books, the true message here is accessible only to those capable of interpreting its allegorical and symbolic language. I think after you read it, you will realize that most people, probably 99% of people, blindly accept dogma, whatever kind of dogma it is, whether that's religious dogma, media dogma, the dogma of your culture. Nietzsche shows that moving past binary moral systems is what is necessary for true maturity, in my opinion. The true seeker needs to move toward an independent evaluation of values and come to their own conclusions. Like the great god Pan, there is a warning here. He who fights with monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster. And if thou gaze long into an abyss, the abyss will also gaze into thee. And I think he's absolutely right. And that's one thing I'm trying to get across with my choices on my list here. Occultism is not just rituals and symbols. There's so much more there. In fact, if I had to put my finger on it, it is a door that opens to mystery. If you're prepared for that door to open, which will open other doors, then you should go through. But having said that, I think there is always a danger to going through those portals or whatever you want to call them. And it's something you have to live with. So I don't think it's something to take lightly. But that's all I got for this one. If you have anything to say, you can post it below. And that's it. Take care. Have a good one.